Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the candlelit corridors and creaky carriages of Middlemarch, that broodingly perfect Victorian town where everyone has an opinion, everyone has secrets, and absolutely no one knows how to mind their own business. You arrive in a swirl of carriage dust and youthful ambition, armed with more good intentions than cash, and a dangerously overdeveloped sense of purpose. You step off the coach wearing your best traveling bonnet, the one that makes you look serious but soft, like someone who could quote Tennyson but still iron her own petticoats. Your boots click on cobblestone, and the scent of manure, moss, and the kind of tea that's been steeped too long fills the air. This is Middlemarch. It's a town where reputations outlast marriages, and you're already late for your first polite judgment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment your location and local time below. I love knowing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move into Loic with your uncle, Mr. Brooke, who has the distracted air of someone who once read Rousseau and never fully recovered. His estate is charming in the way that falling plaster and mildewed wainscoting can be. If you squint, it's practically romantic. There's an unused orangery and a library no one dusts anymore, which to you reads like a challenge. You are Dorothea Brooke, a name that already sounds like it belongs in a footnote or carved into limestone. And you've got plans. You think maybe you'll become a philanthropist or a scholar, or maybe just marry a man of substance and help him change the world, quietly from the background, as a good woman ought. Let's just say, you probably won't survive this, not because anything terrible will happen, but because Middlemarch has a way of grinding down even the most well-intentioned. It's the slow suffocation of ideals under society's featherlight expectations. It's the way women can be brilliant and still only ask to pour tea. And it's the way you fall in love, not with a person but with an idea, and pay for it in boredom and blistering evenings reading Latin you don't understand. Still, on this first evening, none of that has happened yet. You're gazing out the window at a sun-streaked lawn, listening to the distant bleat of a sheep that sounds like it's reconsidering all its life choices. You open your journal, because of course you journal, and write something painfully sincere about improving the moral condition of the poor. You underline it twice. That's when you meet Mr. Casaubon. He's invited to dinner, and your uncle waves vaguely in his direction with a kind of "this might be good for you" tone. Casaubon is all angles and parchment, like a Greek statue someone forgot to finish carving. He quotes obscure theologians before the soup even arrives, and wears a waistcoat the color of old pews. You're immediately intrigued. Obviously, he tells you he's working on a grand project, a key to all mythologies, which honestly sounds amazing, like Dan Brown but in Latin. You imagine yourselves in matching spectacles, decoding ancient texts by candlelight. You think, this is it. This is my great purpose. Mainstream fact time. In the Victorian era, scholarly men were revered as moral beacons, even when they spent decades writing books no one would ever read. Casaubon is textbook, but the fringe tidbit? Some scholars believe George Eliot based him on real-life academic Edward Casaubon, who was so famously dry, his students used to doodle skulls in the margins of his lectures. So, not exactly a dreamboat. Still, when Casaubon walks you through his theories, you don't see the cracks yet. You see meaning, direction. You're in love with the idea of helping him, like being a very noble sidekick. You tell yourself, this isn't romantic, it's spiritual. It's romantic. The town starts to notice. There are murmurs over tea sets. Some find it odd, others call it a meeting of the minds, which is Victorian for, this is weird, but we're too polite to say it. Even Celia, your exquisitely normal sister, says something snippy like, are you marrying him or just editing his footnotes? You laugh, but you also don't answer. One night, you and Casaubon walk along the edge of a sheep pasture. The wee ice fog clings to your boots. He talks about the diffusion of ancient religious symbols across continents. You nod along, pretending you understand phrases like Zoroastrian substratum. He pauses, peers at you through half-moon glasses, and says, "I would find your companionship a boon to my labors." That's Victorian for, "Will you marry me?" And you say yes. Scholarly debate still swirls around whether Dorothea loved Casaubon or just wanted to be close to a cause. But in this moment, you believe it's love. A rare, austere love. The kind with marble busts and footnotes. You don't. Tell anyone how cold his hands were when he took yours. Planning the wedding feels like walking into a very elegant trap. The dress is white, the invitations gold-edged, the cake stiff with too much marzipan. You write a few sonnets in secret, then burn them, because they sounded more confused than romantic. On the morning of your wedding, you stand before a mirror laced with spiderwebs, your veil pinned just slightly off kilter. Your heart doesn't flutter. It pounds, but more like a warning bell. Aunt Julia calls you radiant. Uncle Brooke says something about Rousseau again, and Celia hands you a little silk pouch with lavender in it, like she knows you're going to need calming soon. Coach pulls away from the estate. You glance back once, already unsure what you're leaving behind, or stepping into. As the wheels turn toward your new future, Casaubon beside you reading a Greek tract. You wonder if you've made the right choice. But it's too late now. And, besides, how bad could it be? You smile at the clouds and lean your head against the window, feeling the bump of each cobblestone like a heartbeat counting you forward, toward Loic, toward Latin, toward 1,000 dusty books, and a future, far lonelier than you imagined. The first days at Loic are quiet in a way that feels less peaceful and more pre-haunted. Your new home has the solemn hush of a library no one visits anymore, and the atmospheric charm of a place where someone once definitely died from melancholy. The ceilings are high, the windows are narrow, and the rooms smell faintly of candle wax and academic despair. Casaubon moves through the house like a man chasing ghosts with a pen. He speaks in sentences so long you forget how they started. You follow him at first, notebook in hand, eager to become a kind of assistant wife hybrid. A lifelong helpmeet, as he phrases it with minimal romantic flair. You organize his notes. You ask intelligent questions. You pretend to enjoy things, like patristic intertextuality, which might be thrilling if you were a 12th century monk. But you're not. You're 20. And you've just realized your husband's life's work is an infinite jigsaw puzzle made entirely of beige pieces. You wake one morning to find him already at his desk, scribbling into the same notebook you saw him with yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. You ask him if he'd like to walk through the garden, maybe get some air. He glances at you as though you've asked him to abandon the Nicene Creed. You take the walk alone. Mainstream fact. The Victorian ideal of marriage was often more about duty than passion, especially among the intellectual elite. A good wife was expected to support her husband's work, not necessarily enjoy it. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some Victorian scholars believed that too much reading could overstimulate the female brain and lead to something called hysteria. You, meanwhile, are in danger of falling asleep during a theological footnote on Babylonian flood myths. The servants at Loic speak in whispers. Mrs. Meany, the housekeeper, always looks mildly startled, as if you've caught her in a crime she hasn't committed yet. The butler, Cringe, has the most intimidating eyebrows this side of Westminster Abbey. Still, you persist. You ask Casaubon about his theories, his sources, his conclusions. He responds with cryptic murmurings and the occasional nod, as if you're a pleasant echo rather than a person. You suggest he submit a portion of his work to a journal. He winces. The time is not ripe, he says. You try not to interpret that as code for it's never going to happen. Some nights you dine in silence. Forks scrape porcelain. The clock ticks like it's judging you. Casaubon occasionally breaks the quiet to mention a Greek term with 6 syllables. You nod politely, but your eyes drift to the window, to the world beyond Loic's ivy-strangled walls. One afternoon, in an act of quiet rebellion, you venture into the library alone. The air is thick with old paper and secrets. You run your fingers along the spines. Plato, Aquinas, Anselm, Milton. one scandalously dog-eared copy of Ovid. You light a fire and crack open a tome titled On the Moral Architecture of the Universe. You make it 4 pages before you start doodling in the margins. There's a knock on the door. Casaubon, of course, and I had not authorized the use of that volume, he says, voice tight. You blink. I was reading. He frowns like you've rearranged the stars. You must consult me before engaging with my sources. You close the book gently, like you're laying something to rest. Later, you write in your journal. Marriage is a great revealer. It shows us not only who we love, but how much of ourselves we must leave behind to do so. You don't share that entry with Casaubon. In town, people have already started wondering. You see it in the way the baker's wife looks at you, curious, pitying. You hear it when Celia writes, saying, "Is everything as you hoped?" I imagine. It must be very interesting to discuss mythology over breakfast. You read between the lines. You write back something cheerful and vague, then spend the rest of the afternoon watching a bee throw itself at the window pane. Casaubon, for his part, seems unaware or unwilling to notice your disillusionment. He retreats further into his notes. You start avoiding the study. You take longer walks, sometimes as far as the river, where the reeds bend like they know secrets and the breeze smells like wet stone. One evening, Casaubon looks unusually pale. He places a trembling hand on the table and doesn't finish his soup. You ask if he's all right. He says it's nothing. Later, you hear him coughing behind the door. The sound echoes like something breaking. The doctor is summoned. You meet. Him at the front door, expecting someone old, somber, possibly with a limp. Instead, you meet Dr. Lydgate. He's young, broad-shouldered, and has that distracted look people get when they're always thinking of 5 things at once. He smells faintly of menthol and books. He shakes your hand and smiles. Not a polite smile, but a real one, like he's amused you're even here. You're startled by how grateful you feel, just to be spoken to as if you matter. Lydgate examines Casaubon, mutters about stress and weak constitution. He recommends rest, lighter meals, and perhaps more walks. Casaubon grumbles but agrees. After Lydgate leaves, you stand in the corridor alone, unsure if what just fluttered through you was hope or guilt. Scholarly debate still lingers over whether Casaubon's illness was purely physical or also spiritual, brought on not just by strain, but by the slow crushing weight of his own unreachable expectations. You start wondering, not for the first time, what your life might look like if you'd made a different choice, if you'd waited, if you'd fallen for someone less theoretical. But this is the life you chose, and you're determined to make it work, even if it means pretending your heart isn't quietly dozing off between pages of Neoplatonic commentary. One night you find Casaubon asleep at his desk. The candle is nearly burned down, the ink smudged where his hand dropped. You cover him with a shawl. He doesn't stir. You look at the parchment he was working on. It's the same paragraph he wrote yesterday, and the day before. You take the candle and walk away, down the hall, past the locked rooms and the watching portraits, past your own reflection in the window, which looks a little older than it did when you arrived. You whisper goodnight to the darkness. It doesn't answer, but the silence feels familiar now. And maybe, just maybe, you're starting to understand its language. The frost comes early this year. It spiderwebs across the windows at Lowick, making every pane look like it's been etched with secrets you can't quite translate. You wake to breath clouds in the air, and a damp chill that no amount of tea or prayer seems to shake. Outside, the branches scratch at the glass like they're trying to get back inside, where it's at least marginally warmer and only emotionally cold. Casaubon continues his great scholarly march into increasingly irrelevant terrain. You start to notice that the pages he writes are not accumulating into anything remotely like a book. They are fragments, circles, definitions of definitions of definitions. You wonder if you're looking at a work of genius or the most elaborate game of academic Sudoku in history. And here's where it starts to ache. You begin to miss being understood. Not intellectually. People misunderstand that kind of loneliness. What you miss is the simplicity of being seen without the footnotes, of having someone say, "Yes, you make sense to me," without needing a Latin concordance to back it up. You try again. You bring Casaubon tea, suggest reorganizing his index cards. He barely looks up. I must not lose the thread, he mutters. You nod, even though you're pretty sure the thread was lost somewhere near page 17, right after the bit about the Chaldean cosmogony. Mainstream fact break. The real 19th century scholars who inspired characters like Casaubon often lived in near monastic solitude. Many were never published in their lifetimes, not because they were unworthy, but because the systems they built were too dense to navigate. Now for the fringe tidbit, some Victorian intellectuals believed that excessive celibacy, yes, really, could lead to melancholia of the will, which sounds suspiciously like a euphemism for being crushed by one's own ambition and a lack of hugging. You are not celibate, technically speaking. You are married, but you are beginning to suspect that physical proximity and actual connection are not the same thing. There is one particularly icy morning when you walk into Casaubon's study, and he doesn't even register your presence. You stand there for a long moment watching the ink feather across the page. When you clear your throat, he startles, not at your voice, but like he forgot people existed at all. I was only... You begin. I cannot afford interruptions, he says. Without looking up, you step backward into the hall, and something inside you, a little hope-shaped thing, takes a final bow and exits. Celia writes again. This time her tone is less teasing, more gently worried. If I came to visit, she offers, would you be glad? You consider it for a full hour before writing back a simple, yes please. When she arrives, she brings a whiff of lavender soap, the comforting creak of a lighter presence. She looks around Loic and says, it's heavier than I expected. You don't tell her that some days it feels like you're living in a cathedral built entirely out of size. You take long walks with her, bundled in matching shawls, laughing at squirrels and speculating about people you haven't seen in months. It feels like breathing for the first time in a while. She asks how things are. You say, quiet. She nods and doesn't push. One evening, she asks you if you're happy. You pause. I believe I am useful, you say, which isn't the same thing at all. She touches your hand. You're allowed to want more. That night, you lie awake listening to Casaubon's faint coughing through the wall and wonder what more even means now. You begin spending more time in the library, but not with his books. You start reading novels again, the kind with feelings and weather and people who actually touch each other's hands. You hide them under your shawl like contraband. It feels both small and massive, this secret defiance. You laugh out loud once at a particularly witty character, and then quickly cover your mouth, as if you've broken something sacred. You haven't. You've just remembered who you were. One cold afternoon, you come across Casaubon asleep in a chair, a volume drooped in his hand. You take it gently, set it aside, and pull a blanket over him. His hair is grayer than it was a year ago. His face looks tired in a permanent way, like the walls of Loic are pressing inward on him too. You feel something then. Not love, not exactly, but a kind of worn tenderness, like you would feel for a tree that has outlived its orchard. You kiss his forehead. He does not wake. There's a storm that night. Thunder growls in the distance and the trees thrash like they're trying to dislodge old regrets. You sit by the fire with a book in your lap, not reading, just letting the heat touch your skin. Casaubon calls you from the next room. His voice is smaller than usual. You go to him. He's pale, even paler than normal, and the paper in his lap trembles in his hands. I must ask you something, he says. About my work, about after. You frown. After what? He doesn't answer that part. He holds out a sealed envelope. If anything happens to me, he says, I would ask you to promise that you'll carry forward my research. You take the envelope, fingers grazing his. Of course, you say, even though the words taste like dry parchment. This moment has sparked endless scholarly debate, whether Dorothea felt duty, compassion, or simply didn't want to upset a man whose health was clearly failing. But in the quiet flicker of candlelight. It feels like something else entirely, a bargain written in shadows. You help him to bed. He grips your hand longer than usual. The next day, he collapses in the garden. It's not dramatic. There is no cry, no fanfare, just a slow sinking, like a puppet with its strings cut. You run to him, call for help, and the staff rush in. Is carried back to bed. Dr. Lydgate comes again. His face is grave. He speaks in soft tones and uses the word weakness more than once. Casaubon is conscious, but thinner somehow, faded. You sit beside him all night. He doesn't speak, at eye. Dawn, he reaches for your hand and whispers something about unfinished fragments. Then he closes his eyes. You sit there for a long time, watching the light creep across the wall, the day beginning without him. Later, there is grief, but also, quietly, guiltily, relief. Not because you wished him gone, you didn't, but because the weight of expectations has finally lifted, and you can breathe again without waiting for the sound of a pen scratching in the next room. You find yourself staring out the window for hours, not thinking, just watching the trees and wondering if they miss their leaves the way you miss your certainty. You go to the study, slowly, like you're trespassing in someone else's memory. You open the drawers, the books, the envelope. Inside, there's not a map. There's not a plan. There is instead a request, a clause in the will, one you didn't see coming. He asks that if you remarry, you do not marry a particular person. He names Lydgate. The pen slips from your fingers. The air suddenly feels thinner. And so we end this chapter with a breath caught halfway in your chest. Not grief, not love, but a long, slow unraveling of everything. You sit with the will for a long time. The paper is thin, almost translucent, like it's trying to disappear before your eyes. But the words are unmistakable, etched in precise, spidery ink. A codicil stipulating that if you, the widow of Edward, Casaubon, should choose to remarry, you will forfeit your inheritance if the man in question is Will Ladislaw. You reread the name as if it might vanish on second glance. But there it is. Will. His name, his presence, dropped like a pebble into your newly quiet pond. A very specific exclusion. And suddenly, you realize something. Casaubon had seen what you refused to admit to yourself. That brief moment in Rome, that quickening pulse, that flicker of warmth and brightness around Will. And perhaps in his brittle scholar's heart, he feared it. Feared that someone as alive and uncontainable as Will could undo everything he'd built, including you. You fold the paper with fingers that tremble slightly. This isn't just control from beyond the grave. It's jealousy embalmed in legalese. You set the envelope down, then pick it back up again. You do this 4 times before finally tucking it into your desk drawer. Third one on the right, under the ink pens and the letters you never mailed. Mainstream. Fact. In Victorian England, wills were often used to manipulate the behavior of surviving family members, especially women. Disinheritance clauses for remarriage weren't uncommon, especially if the deceased suspected a rival or feared scandal. Fringe tidbit. One notable Victorian will included a clause forbidding the heir from consorting with actresses or dogs, which says a lot about both Victorian morality and their priorities. You don't tell anyone about the clause, not yet. You let the silence cradle it for now, like a pearl inside an oyster that's not ready to open. The funeral is cold, brisk, appropriately mournful. The sky weeps in a respectable drizzle. People say kind things about Casaubon's mind, his character, his dedication. No one mentions the unfinished nature of his life's work. That part remains politely unspoken, like a hymn no one dares sing. Will. Is there? Of course he is. He stands off to the side, a few rows back, his expression unreadable. You catch his eye for a brief moment, and there it is again. That flicker, that ache, that awful, wonderful warmth that shouldn't exist but does. Afterwards, he approaches. Dorothea, he says, and it's the first time he's spoken your name since before the wedding. He says it like it's something worth saying. Will. He offers condolences gently, earnestly. You nod. Your heart does something complex and inconvenient in your chest. He starts to say more, then thinks better of it. You both stand in silence for a moment. The rain slows. He tilts his head slightly. You look older, you offer with a half smile. I was going to say wiser, but yes, that too. You laugh. It's short and breathy and real. He doesn't ask to see you again. He just smiles, soft and sad, and walks away. You go back to Loic, which now feels not like a home, but like the preserved shell of someone else's obsession. You move through the halls with the aimless grace of a ghost who hasn't realized they're dead yet. You start sorting through his papers, his books, his notes. The key to all mythologies remains resolutely locked. There are outlines without endings, arguments without conclusions, entire pages filled with diagrams that connect Greek deities to medieval monks via a trail of increasingly desperate arrows. You try for a time to understand it, out of respect, out of duty, but the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. There is no end. There was never going to be. Just an infinity of footnotes chasing each other in circles. You close the final notebook with a sigh, and just like that, you let it go. Let the work be what it was. A noble attempt, not a failure. You decide to leave Loic. It's not sudden. It's a slow unpeeling, like winter yielding to spring. You write to Celia, to your uncle, to the lawyers. You arrange for the house to be kept but not lived in. You pack only what you need, mostly dresses, a few books, and one locket with dried flower inside. You settle in Middlemarch, and almost immediately you become interesting. The town is not cruel exactly, but it is curious. A young widow, an intelligent woman with means, a woman who chose to leave a great estate behind and live among people. It's enough to ignite every parlor conversation for weeks. You don't care, or you care a little, but you're too tired to let it stop you. You begin to take walks again, real ones. You sit on benches and sketch faces. You write in your journal without filtering every word for propriety. You start to feel your ribs again, like your spirit has returned to inhabit your body. And then there's Will. He appears like a paragraph you skipped and suddenly remember mid-sentence. He's staying with the Vinceys, working on the Pioneer, trying to do something meaningful. He talks about reform, about justice, about art. He is still the same, brilliant, idealistic, occasionally infuriating. But now there is gravity in his voice, a kind of focused fire. You run into him by accident, at the library of all places. A less romantic setting than a misty field, but more appropriate for two people who once argued about German poetry in front of a bust of Cicero. You smile. He smiles back. It starts as small things. A shared walk, a conversation at a dinner party, a moment lingering a bit too long by the pianoforte. You tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself you're just friends. You lie. One morning he brings you a sketch he made of a cathedral. Sharp lines, soft shading, an attempt to capture the sacred geometry of things. I thought you might like it, he says a little too quickly. You take it, run your fingers along the paper. It's beautiful, you say. You don't say, and so are you. But he hears it anyway. The codicil hovers over everything like a ghost that refuses to knock but still rattles the windows. You think about telling him, about opening that drawer, and laying the whole truth on the table. Instead, you fold the sketch carefully and place it on your mantel. He watches you do it, and for the first time, you see it in his eyes. He knows. Maybe not the details, but enough. One night as you're walking along the river, he finally says it. I love you, you know. You stop walking. It's not a question, not a confession, just a fact placed gently between you. You turn to him. I know, and you. I do, you whisper, but I can't. And that's when you tell him about the clause, the condition, the curse wrapped in civility. He laughs, short and bitter. Of course, even dead he has to win. You don't respond. There's nothing to say. The water moves slowly beside you, reflecting a sky that offers no answers. Scholars still argue whether Will should have walked away, whether he should have fought harder, whether you should have defied it all and risked the scandal. But you both choose silence for now. You part with a kiss that doesn't quite happen, and a heart that won't quite let go. You avoid the marketplace for a while. There's nothing especially traumatic about fresh apples and idle gossip. But after that last walk with Will, everything feels like it could split you open. So you stay indoors, mostly. You answer letters you don't care about. You adjust the position of a chair 4 times in one afternoon and tell yourself it's progress. But eventually, inevitably, you must re-enter the world. Middlemarch doesn't let you stay hidden for long. The town is an expert in curated visibility. Everyone sees what you're doing, but no one says anything directly. Instead, they express concern through carefully inflected small talk. "Oh, we hardly see you about these days, Mrs. Casaubon. My cousin mentioned seeing you reading a novel, I believe. Did I hear Mr. Ladislaw was at the Vincey's again?" Each phrase drips in nicety and insinuation like lace soaked in vinegar. You smile through it all, nodding at people's dogs, complimenting baby bonnets, doing everything except screaming into the nearest hedge. Mainstream fact. In 19th century England, widows were one of the few groups of women allowed a modicum of independence, socially and financially, but only as long as they remained decorously alone. Fringe tidbit. Some etiquette books of the era claimed that mourning attire should be worn for at least 2 years, unless the husband had been of no particular consequence. Guess how many pages were spent defining consequence? You try to wear your mourning with dignity, but the fabric itches. Not physically, but existentially. Like it's less a dress and more a ghost you're supposed to zip yourself into daily. And speaking of ghosts, Will is still around. Not often. He seems to understand that his presence is complicated. But when he does appear at a reading group or in passing by the church, you feel the landscape shift slightly, like something beautiful just slipped behind a cloud. He greets you with that same half-smile, the one that holds both apology and hope. You don't return it. Not because you're angry, but because your face would betray too much. Instead, you throw yourself into good works. That's the phrase everyone uses when they mean socially sanctioned distractions for women with more emotions than options. You visit the poorhouses. You help organize coal distributions. You sit with elderly women who smell like dried lavender and tell stories that loop back on themselves until neither of you knows how they began. You feel useful, but not whole. Your uncle, Mr. Brooke, begins dropping hints about politics. He's decided, against all common sense, that he might run for Parliament. You try to support him, but watching him fumble through speeches is like watching someone attempt to play Beethoven on a broken accordion. Still, it keeps you occupied. And then Lydgate comes to see you. He's not there for medical reasons. He comes because Rosamond, his wife, is not coping, financially, emotionally, spiritually. She wants more than he can give, and it's unraveling everything. You listen to him talk about debt, about the disappointment of ambition, about the slow erosion of a dream under the weight of bills and polite society. You offer tea. He accepts. He drinks it in one gulp like it might make the truth easier to swallow. "I thought I was marrying for love," he says. You meet his eyes. So did I. And there it is, a moment of shared ruin. You don't ask why he came to you. You both know. Because you're someone who understands disappointment as a daily ritual, because grief recognizes itself, even when it's well-dressed. A few days later, Celia visits. She brings her baby, small, pink, and aggressively adorable. She sets him in your lap and says, "He's named Arthur, after James's uncle, not the king, unfortunately." You look into the baby's face and feel something jolt quietly within you. A kind of memory you haven't made yet. Something soft and terrifying. Celia watches you. "You still think about Will," she says. You don't pretend otherwise. "Yes," she sighs, not disapprovingly. "Well, you could do worse." You glance at the mantel, at the folded codicil tucked behind a paperweight. I already did, you say. Celia doesn't press. She just takes your hand and holds it for a while. You walk her to the carriage. The baby sleeps with his mouth open, like someone dreaming of milk and unlimited ceiling fans. As they drive off, a voice behind you says, "You'd make a terrifyingly competent mother." You turn. Will. You hadn't heard him approach. You wonder if he timed it that way. You raise an eyebrow. Terrifying? He grins. The way you handled your uncle's campaign speech last week? I wouldn't dare misbehave. You laugh despite yourself. The sound feels different this time, like the laugh is leading instead of following sorrow. He walks with you, not far, just to the gate. There's a pause before he speaks again. "I want to leave Middlemarch," he says. "Go where?" "My name isn't a footnote to someone else's grudge." You inhale. "Will, I'm not asking anything. Just telling you. I need something clean, something of my own." You understand, probably better than anyone. "Will you write?" you ask. "If you ask me to." You don't answer right away. The gate creaks as the wind nudges it. Finally, you say, "Yes, I'd like that." He nods. "Then I will," and he does. Letters come. Long, brilliant, awkward, brave letters, full of thoughts and musings and half-formed philosophies. You respond with equal care. A new kind of conversation begins, one unbound by place or propriety. You start walking to the post office just to feel the anticipation. He moves to London, finds work in publishing, leaves cheaply, makes friends who argue about art over bitter coffee. He writes that he misses your laugh. You don't tell him that sometimes in the morning you read his letters twice before getting out of bed. Meanwhile, in Middlemarch, change seeps in slowly. Lydgate's reputation falters. The town's old guard resents his modern ideas and his younger wife's discontent. He's brilliant, but brilliance doesn't pay for imported curtains. The hospital project crumbles under bureaucracy. You try to help, but your influence only goes so far. One night, Lydgate tells you he's considering leaving. You nod. "Do you think Will would write a letter of recommendation?" he asks almost sheepishly. You smile. "I think he already has." And he had. Will had written pages about Lydgate's work, calling him the sort of man who will be right long after everyone else forgets why they were wrong. You begin to realize something. You have allies. Not just people who like you, people who believe in you. People who see that you have something to offer beyond inheritance or manners. You start to attend council meetings, quietly at first. Then one day you speak. A suggestion about schools, about coal, about how people live between the spaces. Polite society doesn't see. The room goes still. Then someone agrees, someone else adds to it. Just like that, a voice is born. It's not about Will. It's not even about Casaubon. It's about you. And that, more than anything, feels like the beginning. You begin to sleep with the window cracked open, not because the air is stuffy or the room too warm, but because something inside you longs to hear the world at night. The hush of the street, the occasional murmur of cartwheels on stone, the sigh of wind through trees that were old before you were born. These sounds hold you like a lullaby that's forgotten its words. You dream in fragments of letters written in candlelight, of hands that almost touch, of laughter echoing in libraries. Sometimes, in the morning, the dreams linger. You rise slowly, as though your bones remember gravity differently now. Wrap a shawl around your shoulders and go stand at the window, half asleep and wholly alive. You're changing. Not like a butterfly, too graceful, too expected. More like a house settling into its foundation, one creak at a time. Mainstream fact. In Victorian England, women of your status were not encouraged to live alone. It was considered odd at best, dangerous at worst. But widowhood provided a loophole, a fragile, conditional freedom wrapped in black crepe. Fringe tidbit. Some widows in the 1800s held mourning parties, where they would wear elaborate black dresses and compete for who had the most dramatic veil. Your social circle hasn't sunk quite that far yet. Your neighbors adjust to your presence. Or at least they stop flinching when you walk into a room. You become the subject of fewer conversations and the recipient of more invitations. Tea with the Mrs. Pritchett, a walk with Mrs. Cadwallader, during which she attempts to matchmake. You with no less than 3 different eligible gentlemen, one of whom is only slightly more animated than a grandfather clock. You dodge these suggestions with practiced ease, but when you get home, you reread Will's last letter. It was longer than usual, and different. He wrote about a new project, a pamphlet on tenant rights, about an old woman he saw knitting in the corner of a cafe, her fingers moving like she was weaving time itself. About missing the way you tilt your head when you're listening, like the idea might fall out if you don't hold it in place. You trace his handwriting with your finger, and then you write back, telling him the truth. Not all of it. Not the part where you imagine his voice reading your words aloud, but enough. You tell him that Middlemarch is softer these days, that you feel more yourself than you have in years, that you still remember the cathedral sketch. You post the letter before you can regret it. And then, another shift. Your uncle, Mr. Brooke, decides not to run for Parliament after all. His retreat is quiet, but not unremarked upon. The town breathes a sigh of relief it barely bothers to hide. In the vacuum left behind, you step forward, not all at once. It begins with a single speech to the Ladies' Committee on Education Reform. You suggest a reading room, a place where women might access not just novels, but history, science, poetry. A place to think aloud without apology. There's a moment of stunned silence after you speak. Then a few nods. Then applause. It's not raucous, but it's real. You walk home that day with your head higher, your spine straighter. At the gate, there's a letter, different handwriting, slanted, tight. It's from Rosamond. She wants to meet. You haven't spoken much since Edward's death. You suspected she found the morning a bit too dull, a bit too damp for her taste. But now, this olive branch, unexpected and fragrant. You meet at a tea room near the center of town. She's dressed impeccably, of course, blue silk with tiny pearl buttons. She orders tea in a way that suggests the teapot might audition for part. She looks at you for a long moment before speaking. "I thought I envied you," she says finally. "When he died, when you were free." You raise an eyebrow. That's a strange way to begin. She doesn't flinch. Isn't it? But it's the truth. She speaks of Lydgate's growing bitterness, of money that vanishes as fast as it appears, of wanting to be admired and ending up pitied. You listen. You stir your tea slowly. Then you say, "You're not alone." And it's the first time you mean it in both directions. You talk for over an hour. By the end of it, you've agreed to start a fundraising circle for the hospital, for education, for whatever needs doing. You don't trust her completely, but you believe she wants something better. That's enough for now. That night, you write to Will again. You tell him about Rosamond, about the tea, about how certain kinds of sadness can make unlikely allies. You don't expect a reply immediately. He's in London, he's busy. But the next week, a letter arrives. Inside is a single sketch. 2 women seated at a table, each with a steaming cup, a world of shared secrets rising in the curls of vapor. You smile so hard it aches. Then, your uncle calls on you. He has a proposition. He wants you to oversee part of his estate. Not the big decisions, of course, just some of the more practical matters. Rents, crops, tenants. You say yes before he finishes. You begin walking the land, meeting farmers, listening. One of them, a thin man with hands like knots, tells you about a well that collapsed 3 months ago. No one's fixed it. The water now comes from half a mile away. You make a note. The next day, you hire someone to dig a new one. You don't announce it, but word spreads. The next time you visit, there's a small bundle of carrots left on your doorstep. No note. Just thanks. You place them in a bowl on your table and leave them there for a week, too beautiful to eat. Another letter arrives from Will. He's been offered a permanent post with a reformist journal. It's modest, but steady. He's considering. Yet he writes, "I would take it if I thought there was anything here worth rooting into. But part of me thinks home is still somewhere else." You read that sentence 3 times. Home, you write back. Sometimes we plant ourselves and hope the soil remembers us. No signature, no closing line, just those words. You post it before you can. Talk yourself out of it. Time moves, seasons shift. Middlemarch becomes less like a place you live and more like a place that listens when you speak. People begin calling you simply Dorothea. No longer Mrs. Casaubon or the young widow or that curious girl who married a footnote. Just you. And then, he returns. You don't expect it. He doesn't announce it. You come home from a meeting. There's been a small fire. The foundry, no injuries, but the workers are angry. And find him sitting on your doorstep. Sunset frames him in gold. Like a detail from one of his sketches. You stop. He stands. You say, "Will." He says, "I missed your sky." You don't ask what that means. You just take it in. He's thinner, tired, but still him. You go inside. You sit by the hearth, and the silence is not uncomfortable. Eventually he speaks. I turn the job down. You look at him startled. Why? He smiles, lopsided. Because I realized something. You wait. My work matters. But so does where I do it, and who I do it near. You sit very still. I don't want to be a name in a footnote, he says. I want to be part of a sentence we write together. You breathe. It feels like the first real breath you've taken in months. And then he says, I don't care about the money. You flinch. Will, I know, the clause. I know. But I'd rather have you poor and free than rich and haunted. There is a long, slow moment. Then you rise, you go to the drawer. You take out the codicil, you read it aloud. Every word. He listens. When you finish, you hold it over the fire. You wait. He nods. You drop it in. It curls, blackens, turns to smoke. You don't say anything dramatic, you don't need to. The fire does it for you. The morning after you burn the codicil, you wake to a silence that feels earned. It's not just quiet, it's cleared space. A silence where something else can begin. A beginning that tastes, oddly enough, like toasted bread and slightly oversteeped tea, which Will tries to pass off as robust. You smile and he laughs, and for the first time in your life, you don't immediately calculate what the moment means. You just let it sit there, warm and breathing. There's still no proposal, no ring, no vows, only coffee in mismatched mugs. And Will setting up his sketchbook on the windowsill again like it never left. You watch him draw, the soft scratch of pencil brushing paper, and wonder if this is what contentment feels like. Not fireworks or revelations. Just this, someone in your space who doesn't need narrating. Mainstream fact. In 19th century England, marriage for love was romanticized in novels, but often derided in real life as impractical, particularly among the upper and middle classes. Economics and property outweighed passion nearly every time. Fringe tidbit. There was actually a group of women known as the Langham Place Circle in the mid-1800s, advocating for marriage reform, women's property rights, and equal education. You imagine them sipping strong tea and occasionally launching petitions like tiny grenades. You start reading your own letters again, the ones you wrote to yourself in your first marriage, little scraps you hid in books, drawers, pockets. Notes that said things like, remember what you liked before him, or you were a lighthouse before he even saw the shore. You thought they were survival, but now they feel like scaffolding. Will leaves again, but only for a week this time. A job. A quick sketch commission for a railway station mural. He promises to return with stories and maybe a splinter or two. You wave him off with a smirk, and then immediately panic that you waved like an ant. In the absence of romantic tension, your life becomes weirdly efficient. You spend your days writing proposals for the reading room, managing estate repairs, and hosting a bi-weekly gathering of women who now trust you not to condescend. One of them, a widow named Eliza with one functioning eye and an addiction to lemon sweets. Asks you point blank whether you're living in sin with that painter. Fellow, you raise an eyebrow. I'm living in Middlemarch, you say. That's scandal enough. She snorts so hard she chokes on a lemon drop. You pat her back while she wheezes. The town's still talking, of course, but the tone has changed. It's, less can you believe and more have you heard, which is essentially Victorian, for she might actually be pulling it off. Will returns with a sunburn and a sketch of a horse so lopsided you ask if it's meant to be abstract. It was moving, he says defensively, toward the nearest exit by the look of it. He draws a mustache on the horse and calls it justice. You settle into something resembling rhythm. You cook together, burn things together. You read aloud by candlelight, sometimes forgetting what you're reading because you're too rapt. Up in the warmth of the room, and one night without fanfare or orchestration, he asks if you want to get married. You look at him over the rim of your teacup. No dowry, no inheritance, no footnotes, no footmen. You say yes. You get married in a small chapel on the edge of town. 10 people come. You wear a dress that isn't white. He wears boots that aren't polished. It's perfect. You don't honeymoon, unless you count falling asleep on the same pillow and waking up to someone stealing the blanket as a romantic getaway. You think maybe you do. You keep working. He keeps drawing. You buy an old dog with one ear and a name no one remembers. You call him Chap. You start teaching, just 1 day a week, to a group of girls too smart for needlepoint and too tired of being told to be quiet. You tell them the world is large and their thoughts are larger. One of them writes an essay comparing Plato to pickled. Onions, you give her a gold star. Rosamond visits occasionally. She's softened. Still vain, still stubborn, but with less edge. She brings you ribbon and gossip and asks if she's doing the widow thing right. You tell her to be herself, just quieter. One day you're walking with Will through a muddy lane when you pass Reverend Fairbrother. He tips his hat, hesitates, and then says, "You look well." You smile. "I am." He nods, eyes kind. Good. There aren't enough endings like that in Middlemarch. You keep walking, and you know he's right. Scholarly debate swirls even now around whether your story, the Dorothea arc, is optimistic or bittersweet. Whether marrying for love after marrying for intellect is a progression or a regression. Whether your freedom is truly yours or just another costume. You let them wonder. You're too busy planting lavender because you have a garden now. Small, unruly, half wild, but it's yours. Will builds a tiny shed in the corner of it for sketching and sulking, both of which he claims are essential to his process. You install a bench, a place to read, a place to dream. Sometimes you sit there for hours just listening, to bees, to the wind in the grass, to the sound of your own breath even. You think about how far you've come, from the girl desperate to be good, to do good, to the woman who understands that being is its own form of goodness. One day, your cousin Celia visits. She brings her children, who promptly run riot through the garden, chasing butterflies and shrieking about worms. Celia looks around with a slightly wrinkled nose. "It's very you." You grin. "Thank you." She hesitates. "You seem happy." It sounds almost like a question. You nod. "I am." Celia watches the children. "It's strange, isn't it? How life folds out. What we thought we'd be. What we are." You shrug. "Maybe it's both." You make lavender tea, which she pretends to enjoy. Will joins you after an hour, smudged with ink and carrying a drawing of Chap wearing a crown made of radishes. Celia stares at it. "That's not flattering." Will shrugs. "It's accurate." You laugh. Chap sneezes. The kids start a game called Royal Worm Chase. The sun slides behind the clouds like a secret, and for a moment the world feels like something soft. You can hold in both hands. You send Celia off with a bouquet, and a warning about the children starting a government of their own. That night, Will reads to you from a book about clouds. Apparently there are names for all of them. Cirrus, Cumulus, Nimbostratus. He tries to convince you to name your next dog Alto Cumulus. You suggest naming your next husband Nimbostratus, just to be safe. You fall asleep with laughter still stitched to your ribs. You dream of libraries, of quiet revolutions, of chalk on blackboards and letters sealed with wax. You dream of a younger version of yourself, standing in the middle of Middlemarch, asking what's next. You want to tell her everything, but you don't. She needs to find out on her own. The first thunderstorm of spring arrives without ceremony. No grumbling buildup or streaks of forewarning lightning. Just a sudden crack in the sky and a downpour so violent it makes the windows shudder. You're in the middle of reading when it starts. Will is trying to boil potatoes with vague enthusiasm, and Chap is attempting to burrow under the rug like it's a foxhole. You watch the water bead against the glass, the whole garden dissolving into watercolor, and just for a moment, you feel suspended. Not in a bad way, in the way a balloon might hover when someone forgets to let go. Rain in Middlemarch is rarely poetic. It's more of a persistent inconvenience, but this time, it makes everything softer. Softer smells, softer air, softer edges to memories that used to come with splinters. You remember walking in the rain once, long ago, trying to outpace the feeling that you had made a mistake too big to name. Now the storm just feels like an excuse to pause, a natural invitation to loaf. Will gives up on the potatoes and brings you half-burnt bread and jam. You pretend it's gourmet. He says it is, actually. It's called La Tartine Noire and is all the rage in imaginary cafes. You toast the occasion with lukewarm tea and exaggerated French accents. Mainstream fact. In Victorian England, bad weather was considered a legitimate excuse to cancel social engagements. Some hosts even included a weather-permitting clause on invitations. Thank you, 1850s, for formalizing the adult version of I don't feel like it. Fringe tidbit. There was a widely circulated belief among the pious that lightning could not strike a Bible. Naturally, many a devout Victorian clutched their copy during storms, which didn't always work out. Faith meets physics, and sometimes, physics wins. You spend the next day clearing branches, straightening toppled flower pots, and laughing at Chap's attempts to herd puddles. It's hard to stay serious when your dog looks like a drowned scarf. The garden, battered though it is, hums with renewal. Rain always leaves something behind. Will sketches you kneeling beside the marigolds, hair frizzed, hands muddy. You try to snatch the sketchbook. He dodges. Chap takes this as permission to sprint in chaotic loops. Later that week, you get an invitation. A proper one, embossed paper, gold leaf. The whole, please do not spill tea on this affair. It's from a committee, Middlemarch's newest attempt to seem cosmopolitan. A cultural soiree complete with speeches, art, and selected readings from promising local authors. You raise an eyebrow at that last bit. Will naturally is delighted. He starts laying out your options like it's a heist. You wear something understated, but with flair. I'll stand behind you looking handsome and underemployed. We dazzle. You do know it's a fundraiser for the Newtown fountain, right? All the more reason to look expensive. You end up wearing the same dress you wore to marry him. A statement in frugality, or feminism, depending on who asks. You enter the hall and immediately feel 17 again. Unsure, overly visible, too aware of your own elbows. Then you see the looks. People nod, smile, tip hats. A few still purse. Their lips, but with less venom now. More like they've accepted your survival as fact, if not their preference. Rosamond is there, of course, dressed like a swan and floating through the room with well-practiced grace. She catches your eye and smirks. Careful, you're becoming respectable. Don't jinx it. You read aloud that night, a piece about community and contradiction and why lavender thrives in neglected soil. It's short, simple, a little whimsical. But when you finish, the applause is real. Will squeezes your hand. Chap, who snuck in via an open door, howls once in solidarity. You start getting requests to write more. Not just dry proposals or letters to distant benefactors, but essays, observations, short pieces on gardens and grief and the curious intersection of laundry and existential dread. It's like the town has finally realized you're not just a widow with opinions. You're a person with sentences. Well-constructed ones. And sentences, as you once told a skeptical teenager in the reading room, can change the shape of a life. You start writing early in the mornings, before the town wakes. Feet tucked under a wool blanket, a cup of tea cooling. Beside you, the light just beginning to brush the rooftops. Will sketches while you write. Sometimes he draws you without your noticing. You find the evidence later in his notebooks, your profile mid-yawn or your hand reaching for the sugar spoon. You read together in the evenings. Not for knowledge anymore, for the rhythm. You read aloud passages that make no logical sense but sound like honey. He reads you bits of dialogue from terrible plays. You compete for the worst line. One night he wins with, "I fear my love for you has exploded like a souffle of emotion." You nearly choke on your tea. Spring turns to summer. The town heats up emotionally and otherwise. Children shriek through the streets, coated in dust and optimism. The reading room is suddenly full of girls asking about science, and boys nervously pretending to care about poetry. You host a garden reading on a dare. It's humid, chaotic, and completely unhinged. Someone brings a lute. You tell the story of a woman who rebuilt her life using library cards and the stubborn refusal to apologize for her favorite color being orange. People laugh. Clap. Someone cries. You serve lemonade made by a recipe you found, scribbled in the back of a book titled Household Management for the Melancholic. The lemonade is excellent. You are baffled. A few days later, you and Will walk the edges of Middlemarch, past the town, beyond the pastures, to a spot near a stream where wild thyme grows like it's auditioning for a perfume ad. You sit on the grass, dirt under your fingernails, dragonflies buzzing like tiny helicopters overhead. He looks at you, not in the way people look when they're trying to memorize you, in the way people look when they already have. You lean back. Close your eyes. The ground is warm. The air smells like mint and damp stone. He reaches for your hand. You let him take it. Scholarly debate lingers around what kind of happiness is possible after ruin. Whether certain lives can ever be redeemed, or if that's just a convenient fiction. Whether Dorothea Brooke's story is triumphant, or simply less tragic than it could have been. You open your eyes and decide it doesn't matter. You are here. You are breathing. And for now, that's enough. Later that evening as you walk home, Will starts naming stars. You suspect half of them are made up. That one's Elboeus, patron saint of poorly hinged gates. And that one, Glumbula, the weeping lantern. You stop, laugh, tip your head back. The sky is smeared with light. The town sleeps. You do not. You feel awake in a way that doesn't require coffee or adrenaline or doubt. You feel like the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. One that didn't end the way the grammar books expected, but one that still makes sense.